I met Soraya freshman year of college. We both went to Georgetown University. Um, and yes, exactly, Hoya Saxa. And her now husband was in a sort of, at the time, experimental program.
Right, brand new.
Called American Studies, which was this interdisciplinary course of studies that you had to sign up for and commit to as a freshman. And my roommate and your husband became really good friends, and then we became friends.
We became friends.
And I was this weird anomaly because I was from LA, which at the time was very unusual to go to Georgetown, and I was Jewish. And I was on a co-ed floor, so it was like this triple whammy.
Which dorm were you in?
I was Harbin 8. And yeah, it was a really big deal. Like, it was a Catholic Jesuit school, and I lived on the co-ed floor, right?
Yeah.
Like those racy people from LA,
That's
they
right.
had no morals. But where did you live?
I lived in New South.
New South, that's right.
Right,
That's
which
right.
is small.
That's right. And I chose Georgetown because I had grown up here my whole life and knew I wanted to be in the entertainment business, but had to get out of LA in order to come back to LA. And I knew nothing more other than I wanted a campus in a big city.
Yes, that was pretty
And
much what
I wanted
did.
liberal arts. I ended up being an English major. And you were an English major, weren't you?
It's
Or
history.
History. Okay, you're a history major. And then, so how did you get to Georgetown?
How did I get, like you, I'm from the Bahamas,
Right.
but like you, I just wanted to be in a city.
Right.
And so there weren't a lot of options that also weren't cold. I'd spent time in Massachusetts, and I was not going to stay in Massachusetts or anywhere near Massachusetts.
Right.
And DC was a great city.
Yeah,
you
it
know.
was. It's great.
It was
well,
a
maybe
great-
not today, but it's
Actually, it's
Maybe not this hour.
fabulous today, but not really right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so I think the other funny thing too is I went back to Georgetown maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I was mentoring a mentoring program for girls, and went into the women's center, and the director of the women's center said, "Oh, you know, well, we've had a legacy of women doing things at Georgetown," and she pulls out this binder and she opens it up, and there are 10 years worth of a magazine called A New Press, which we were founders of with 2 other friends who were in the audience, and she didn't know that. And so there they all were, which was so funny.
Which is so scary, because
Which
I
is so
completely
scary.
forgot. That's so
Yeah.
sad. Well, we were also, it was, and I say this to people now who are our kids' generation, they kind of look at me cross-eyed. We had started Georgetown at the tail end of the ERA. And so we were just coming out of our formative high school years, having this sort of ERA or bust and equal rights for women, and then we show up at Georgetown, and we were these sort of slight anomalies of,
Very anomalous.
women's rights, and we
Right.
should be, heard, and, let's start this newspaper. And so, and I remember I was in student government, and there was
Right.
there was all this stuff that happened.
I just remember people asking us, I was asked several times if we would have centerfolds.
I don't remember that.
I definitely happened
Oh my
multiple
gosh.
times. Oh, you're starting a women's magazine? Will you have centerfolds? Yeah,
Yeah, well, at least it persevered. That's the good news.
it did persevere,
At least it persevered.
but some things never change.
That for sure. Oh my gosh. Okay, so you then became a writer after you
Yes.
traveled around the world, and I went into the entertainment business. So why don't you talk a little bit about how you made it? Because we were talking backstage about how you had traveled a lot before you had kids.
Right.
And Thomas and Soraya have been together for a very long time, and he's a great guy. And they have 3 beautiful daughters. I have 2 sons, which makes this conversation really interesting, which we'll get to in a little bit. But talk a little bit about how you became a writer, and then I really want to get into
Sure.
what motivated this.
So had this interest in college, left college, started writing. I went to France, and then I did some journalism, various jobs in journalism in the United States, and then wanted to eat food and buy clothes. So I switched from the writing side to the business side. And actually, on the business side, I did strategic marketing and market development in data and tech. And that turned out to be super important for the writing I do now, because so many of the issues we encounter have to do with data and technology and algorithmic inequality. And so it's been really an interesting overlap. In 2008 or 9, I started writing again, and I think that was really a direct result of rage that I didn't recognize properly. I was stunned by a culture that I thought was going backwards as a parent. Like, I just think I hadn't really thought about the fact that we were living in this era of backlash, and that the sort of progress that would be nice to believe is natural is not. And so I think writing was a form of sublimation that was very effective, because I could
Almost
say
like
things.
like journaling, where you can
Almost like journaling.
Yeah, there's no one else to talk to about it, so you might as well write it somewhere
Right.
and put it somewhere.
But the problem is when you do that online, it's not journaling.
Right.
And so everybody tells you how they think. And so immediately, I could have been writing about children's shoes. You know, I could have said, let boys wear pink shoes, because let them freely express themselves. And the response was more or less, die, dumb cunt. Right, like over and over and over again. And so you get these messages, and if you can step back and think about what they represent, it's pretty clear that they are part of an incredible hostility to women just speaking publicly with authority about anything, whether they're in media, whether they're in sports, whether they're in medicine. It's irrelevant. It's just the fact that we are taking up this space that is reserved for men and masculinity.
I really loved, and I wonder if this coincided, you say you started writing again in 2008, 2009, so you took time off.
So I did. I worked the
kids.
whole time.
You did.
I did, and I worked at Gannett, and then I worked for a company called Claritas, which was a pioneer in something called geodemography, which was understanding consumer marketing patterns. It was a research-intensive place. And then I did consulting for 10 years, during which I had very young children. So 3 under the age of 3 kind of really makes life insane. And
For women.
for women, although I will say that we have twins, and it doesn't leave men, I think, in heterosexual relationships the same wiggle room. It just doesn't. It actually forced us to behave in ways that's more likely in like a lesbian marriage, really, because what it forced us to do was actually have very specific conversations about responsibilities that otherwise don't necessarily happen.
Right.
You know, you don't really have a choice. They will defeat you no matter what. And that's more or less what we faced.
And you were on zone defense, because it was
Absolutely.
It was never one-on-one.
There was no gradual slide into anything.
Right.
It was just 1 to 3. And in retrospect, it was really hard, and I don't really remember the first 5 years. But it was actually not a bad thing in terms of our parenting more effectively together.
Right.
However, having said all of that, very clearly, as the children got older and we went into institutions like schools and sports, there was an insane pressure to conform to traditional gender roles and expectations. It just happens no matter how hard you fight it, no matter how progressive you might be. It's very difficult to break out of those roles because, especially honestly, if you are, it happens more in couples that are educated in the same way if they have educational parity. And so women, I remember this so clearly, it was like, 2000, 2001, there was a very famous article about women opting out, and Lisa Belkin wrote it. She's since sort of renounced it, but women don't opt out, women are pushed out. And they're pushed out because of the institutional barriers that really make us angry without our knowing how to articulate it.
So the seeds for the book were sowing as you moved through the world with your kids. And then when did you finally get the idea to actually write this book?
So just around the election. So I'd had a book proposal sort of in the works for several years.
That will make anyone angry, that election. So.
The election just was so clear, right? And so just after the election, I had taken the book proposal back to my agent and I'd rewritten it. And we had a strange interaction because I was sitting at home and I was thinking, wow, I wonder if that proposal is just really too angry sounding. I was sitting there and I was like, but I just don't know. I just have to send it and get it out of my system, right? And she called me and she said, you know, every time you write with anger, people in the office can't put it down, so I think that's what we should focus on. And then it was just like click, 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 and that was it. So I wrote the book actually in between September and December of last year. And it was a very fast pace, but it was quite clear. It was just like, oh, of course, this is what I need to talk about. And so it had been brewing for a long time.
I think it's really funny because when I read it, nothing about it felt angry. So I think it's really interesting that the intensity or the veracity with which you write was seen by whoever it was in the office as angry.
Right, aggressive.
As aggressive. And because I didn't read it that way, I thought it was and again, it was not because you asked me to do this. It was incredibly eloquent. I mean, I read for a living. That's all I do is read, and I find it really fascinating that the angrier you get, the more impactful you become in terms of reaching an audience. But you were just speaking your truth.
Right, and I think too. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience. I sort of joke, but it's not really a joke, that all I have to do to be considered angry and aggressive is walk into the room. Like, I'm here, and people are like, ugh, she's really belligerent. And I'm like, not really, So I think that there's that quality that no matter what you say or how you say it, no matter how much you try and change the tone or the framing, it is irrelevant.
Right.
And so we just have to get past that and do what we want to do.
Yeah, and it's also a little bit of that bitchy resting face thing.
We were talking about that
where
earlier.
It's like, well, if you're not sitting in every meeting with a big fat smile on your face,
do you not want to smile?
It's like, no, I'm just listening to you. I'm like actually taking this in, or I'm thinking. I'm not really being bitchy at all. I'm just existing.
Well, there is this really great irony to that, which is that all these studies show that people associate a gender-neutral face that looks angry with men. They just assume it's a masculine or man's face. And it turns out that that's not just a male anger bias that leads us to think men have more anger, but in fact, men's faces in resting position are bitchier. That's just like now studied and understood, right? And so no one ever really talks about that because we don't expect men to be visually pleasing all the time.
Right.
Although it is nice when they are.
Yeah, of course. One of the things that I loved in the book, we were talking about this a little bit backstage, was all the writing you did in the book about motherhood and the feelings around motherhood. And I love the anecdote about nursery school with the boy that was knocking over the blocks, which is so accurate. And having, as a parent and watching it and watching the differences between the boys and the girls. But I really want to talk, because I love talking about this with younger women in the entertainment space as well. The whole notion of what it takes to balance being a career professional and a mother, and that for a woman they're not mutually exclusive, but the cultural institutions say that it is. They are mutually exclusive. And my own experience was I worked at Sony for 17 years, and I had both of my boys while I was at Sony. And my own experience was, first of all, there was no maternity leave. I took 6 weeks of disability and 6 weeks of vacation that I had accumulated. So essentially my pregnancy, my maternity leave was a disability. That's how it was dealt with.
Which is how insurance more or less dealt with it,
correct.
too.
And I certainly hope that's changed since I left, but it happened with both of my kids. And I had professionally plateaued once I had my kids. Now, I subsequently moved on, but what I found really fascinating was both my experience, which I'll get to, and the fact that I couldn't articulate my feelings about that experience. So I had my first son at 31, and then 4 years later I had my second son, and I became an executive vice president at 31, and at 41 I was still an executive vice president. And the men that were around me, who were very close colleagues of mine and friends to this day, went from being vice presidents to senior vice presidents to executive vice presidents to 2 of them got promoted to president, and I was still an executive vice president. And so I had a lot of feelings about that, but I also loved my job, and I was also very grateful for the opportunity and environment that allowed me to be a parent. But I also, there was no one to articulate that to, and I also was really struck by the fact, and I know you have a chapter that talks about this, that becoming a parent wasn't just like, okay, I'm going to get pregnant. It was like years of planning and then being pregnant and then maternity leave and then reentry. There was just years of your life that
Right.
was devoted to just even that one child. And then to think about doing it all over again, they're really, you kind of go on this exit lane, and then you're traveling over on the emergency access road down here
Right.
that's going in the same direction, but it's not on the highway. And then at some point you feel like you can re-enter
Right.
it. But I'm really fascinated to hear you talk about that a little bit more, because there was the practical, but there was this feeling. It was like, well, wait a minute, why am I not allowed? And I had all these pithy sayings that I still say to this day to young women that want to ask me about it. I'm like, I never asked for permission to have a kid, but I never used my kids as an excuse. So I was always walking this
Right.
tightrope of, I'm never going to say I can't do something because I'm a parent, but I'm never going to ask you if I can go to Mommy and Me, or if I can go, take my kid to school every morning and come in a half an hour late, or whatever it
Right.
was. And it wasn't until after I got through that I thought, yeah, that was really kind of crummy. Like,
Well, yeah, I mean, you would rather say, I'm going to be late because I have a flat tire than I'm going to be late because I
Right.
have a sick child and I need to wait until someone comes and helps
Right.
me, right? So in the book, I have a chapter called The Care Mandate, which is about the automatic assumption of feminine care in almost any context, at work, at home, as politicians. If you look at conservative politicians, women, they always lead with the fact that they're mama bears. They can do their job because they're really good mothers, first and foremost. And so we care more for children and the elderly. I mean, it's just a fact. You can just look at the statistics and time. And in fact, an uncomfortable way of putting it for people is that because girls and women, and it's also girls, do an average of 2 hours more in terms of chores or domestic work, they actually create 2 hours of leisure time for men. Right?
I hadn't really thought about that.
Well, that's what happens.
But of course it
right?
is.
And so it's the whole assumption of free care, whether it's in a home or in the society, is a transfer of wealth. It's a gender transfer of wealth. And it doesn't enter our GDP. It isn't part of our economic formulations, and yet we bear the burden of that. And we bear the burden of it in terms of our long-term financial vulnerability and instabilities and all of these other things. And so there's care and this assumption of care that causes a lot of anger and resentment that we don't really want to talk about, because what kind of good woman resents taking care of the people she loves? Nobody wants to be that person, right? And so what's interesting to me about having children is that there's being a mother, and then there's all these ideals about motherhood. So in America, we really love motherhood, and we really hate mothers. Right? We don't take care of mothers, we don't support mothers, we don't support them in the workplace, we don't support them in hospitals. We have the highest rates of growing maternal mortality in the developed world. Black women are 3 to 6 times more likely to die giving birth here. It's insane what women physically have to deal with when they are going through any number of reproductive situations. But what we don't talk about too is the imminence of pregnancy. We are all assumed to be potential mothers, even before we get pregnant. So in the workplace, that means there are all kinds of professional biases that discriminate against fertile women. And so there was one study in the UK that showed that 40% of managers said they would prefer not to hire a woman in their 20s because she was just going to go get pregnant and leave, which is bullshit anyway, right? That's just not, very few people can afford to just get pregnant and leave. And so even if you choose to be child-free, in fact, your job, your salary, your ability to progress professionally are calibrated to the expectation that women will have children, and that will be a personal problem for them, that the society and the institution will not support them in any of these contexts. And so there's that, and then you get to the point where maybe you decide you want to have children, and you try to have children, or you have those children, and then for many women, particularly if they're white women, they encounter the fact of discrimination for the first time. Like, oh, maybe I should hide my pregnancy a little longer. Maybe I shouldn't talk about it at work or not let them know. What am I going to do about the time I take off? How am I going to, reach the sort of highest salary level I can, because I want to come back at that salary level, which never happens, right? It just doesn't happen. And so for the first time, women are like, wow, this is a problem. But it's amazing how few of us think of it in terms of discrimination. Pregnancy discrimination affects all women, whether they have children or not. And so that causes a lot of depression, anxiety, frustration, rage. All of your relationships change when you have a child. The way you're perceived, the way you perceive yourself, your relationship with your spouse, your parents, your other children. And so it's almost as though we're just not supposed to have those feelings, or certainly not talk about them.
And they're not, and again, it's not, there's no mutual exclusivity. You
No.
can love your kids
Right.
and be really frustrated that whatever is going on in that moment, or love your job. You know, I say to other women when they ask me how I did it, that was also, by the way, a question I always hated. How do you do it all?
Yeah.
Because there was, underneath it, I always felt like there was some passive aggressive evaluation of the fact that I was a working mother. Not, I never felt guilt as a working mom. I mean, my kids are old enough now that they're fairly self-sufficient. I certainly hope my 21-year-old's self-sufficient, but, you know, my mother was a very unique person in that she was a working woman in the 50s. She was a dancer, she was a rockette, and she lived on her own. And you know, I was born, she was 34, which in the 60s was ancient.
Right.
You know, and but she was always miserable when she couldn't dance, because that was who she was, and she'd been a dancer since she was a child. So when I chose to become a parent, I knew that I was not going to parent from a place of guilt, right? I was really open and forthright about it with all my friends, and I had no guilt about leaving my kids to go to work, because I knew I was a better parent, because for 8 hours a day or whatever it was, I was doing something that was really stimulating to me. But I always got this, like, I don't know how you do it all. How do you
Right.
manage it all? Which is really not a compliment.
No.
There's something underneath
dig-
it.
dig
There's a
to
little
it.
dig of like, you know, why do you do it? Why
Are
do
you
you do
still
it all?
working?
Are you still working?
Yeah, I got that a
why
lot.
Are you doing
Are you
that?
still working?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing, to go back to your point about discrimination, which I think is really interesting, I like to host college kids from Georgetown, or from now Pitzer, where my son goes, and my colleague Chris is somewhere in the audience. We have people coming from JMU, which is where he went, and a lot of the women are nervous about coming into the entertainment space because they're terrified about having families.
Well, that's true everywhere.
And I find that a really sad brain drain, because you're talking about, we haven't done a good job as a culture, and certainly, and I can only speak for myself in the entertainment space, of modeling enough for younger women that it can be done. And that, no, you may not be the president of the whatever by the time you're 30 years old, but there are ways of accomplishing it. And it makes me so sad when I hear that, because I think, gosh, after all of this, there are still women that would, when they're confronted with.
But they don't really have a choice, right? Because in fact, we refuse to institutionally support them.
That's
They're not
true.
being unrealistic.
Right.
There's really nothing an individual woman can do about these
Right.
problems,
That's
right?
true.
And also, what an immense privilege to say, are you still working?
Right.
You know, we're arresting like women who are forced to leave their children in their car to go for a job interview,
Right.
because they have absolutely no resources, no money, no care, nothing, right? And so I think that until we elect people that understand why it's important to support working parents and not penalize women or men, right? Because men are penalized for trying to be more flexible and for not adhering to norms of masculinity and a certain kind of provider fatherhood. But there is a motherhood penalty and there's a fatherhood bonus. That's real. So, you know, when we have children, women's salaries go down and men's salaries go up. That's not magic. We do that as a society, right? So until that stops, which really won't stop until we have some firm policies in place, then it makes sense for a woman to worry, because she knows that it's going to disproportionately impact her. And that's not a fantasy, you know, that's real.
Of course. So let's talk a little bit about Me Too and Time's Up, and whatever else you want to call it. So you wrote the book between September and December of last year, and smack in the middle of that period of time, Harvey Weinstein happened,
Right.
and then the dominoes started falling. And um, and I'm curious as to whether or not that affected how you finished the book, and certainly how the book has been received, and the feedback you've gotten in any of those, from any of those, you know, areas of our culture right now.
Well, yes, all of the above. So you can't keep up fast enough. Like, I'm sure everybody here maybe thought that at noon they understood how many people had accused Kavanaugh. But by 2, you would have known that you were wrong. And then by 4, if you were me, you would have known that you were wrong again, right? And so editing a book in that environment, which is really what was happening, because, you know, you have to edit it for 3 or 4 months, there was never enough you could do to keep up. And in the process, too, we went into all the cycles of naming and shaming and backlash. And so now we're seeing, you know, oh, I deserve to come back because I do. That's more or less the argument.
Right.
Like, I deserve to come back, so let me come back.
Right.
Right? And there are enough people saying, sure, we want you to come back, right? So you can get up and tell that first rape joke again. And so that can't go in the book because it's done. Like, the minute it's printed, it's done. But, you know, every day, as all of us know, we're hearing these stories, and in fact, what's happening right now is what happened after the grab 'em by the pussy tape, which is that so many women are re-traumatized. They literally are dredging memories up that they had hidden from themselves. And they're explaining those memories to themselves and to the people around them. And so watching the news is super hard. Picking up your phone, which is pushing information at you, is super hard. And all of that also generates a lot of negative feelings. And part of the point of the book is that we learn to think about anger in terms of those negative feelings. Anger is destructive. It's, you know, related to shame and fear and contempt and disgust and this cluster of negative feelings. But in fact, what we're seeing too that we don't talk about is that anger is also compassionate and justice-seeking and empathetic.
Well, it's a change agent.
It's a change agent. And so if you can take that anger and not let it consume you, and there is a chapter about that consumption, what it means to not recognize the anger or label it. It affects our bodies and our health and our mental states. And I mean, I was shocked by the range of health impacts that unacknowledged anger has on people's bodies. Because we know that discrimination causes pain and harm and shorter lifespans. And we know that there are 20 years worth of studies about what racial bias and discrimination mean for people with black and brown bodies, right? But somehow we still refuse to acknowledge the discrimination that women encounter as a factor in women's maladies. They're all of the, you know, women are the vast majority of the 100 million people with chronic pain. They're the vast majority of people seeking treatment for anxiety and depression, for eating disorders, all of those things. And yet all of that gets dismissed as somehow a function of the fact that we have 2 X chromosomes instead of the parameters of our lives.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I found really fascinating with, I mean, again, being in the entertainment space for a very long time, you know, I was fortunate enough to have several female mentors in a very unique situation. I had women at Sony, and they were really good mentors in terms of supporting me professionally and particularly as a parent, you know, sort of modeling and being supportive that way. But all of this other stuff was going on. And even though I wasn't the direct recipient of it, I knew so many people that were.
Right.
And at least at Sony in particular, I mean, in other working situations, I have been more privy to it. And what I find really interesting now as a movement is it's such an explosion of emotion
Right.
that it's almost impossible to contain almost productively. You know, Time's Up has done a remarkable job, I think, in terms of branding their message, and they're very nimble and very responsive and can get out there very quickly. And they also have like 100,000 different tentacles in so many
Right.
different directions. And that's the other thing that is the people who are not in the Time's Up movement, which I would have to say are people that have an X and a Y chromosome because they're not on the receiving end of it, they really want it to just be one thing,
Yeah,
and
it's
you
not.
can't, it can't be.
It's not.
You
It's
know,
everything.
Exactly. You
Right.
can't, there's this desire of, okay, we get it. You're mad because, the old boys club or this or that. Okay, so we'll address it. But no, no, no. Okay, you've addressed that. There's a whole nother thing over here that you haven't looked at. And I firmly believe that the way through it is dialogue. It can't just be everybody who's a woman over here and everybody who's a man over there, and all of you guys are bad.
Right.
And again, we were talking a little bit about this before. I don't know how to. I don't know how my boys are going to enter the world right now with all of this going on, because they think about it every day. How should I interact, and what should I say to this girl, and I don't want it to be misconstrued.
Right.
And I had a lunch recently with a guy who I've known since Sony, and I sat down, and he'd just started a new job at a new company, and it had just been announced that I had taken over as president of the Board of Women in Film. And I said to him, "Oh, how's the new job going?" "Great, great, great." I'm like, "Oh, I have a question. Are there any women working at your company? Because I'm a producer, and so I want to find other women." And he immediately went, "Why are you asking me that? Like,
Right.
you're the head of Women in Film. What are you doing? What do you mean?" I mean, it was, if I hadn't gone into that lunch with just the sort of Women in Film crown or
Right.
sign or whatever it was, it would have been a perfectly normal conversation.
Right.
But through that filter, he thought that it was,
So
there was a whole nother agenda to it.
So I think it's interesting because I don't know how many people here have gone through like a phase of heightened feminist awareness in life. Right? Like, have you? Right? And what happens is that it's insanely raw.
Yeah.
Everything is raw. Everything is bad. Everything
Right.
hurts. Everything's depressing. Everything's enraging. It's a clusterfuck of badness, right?
Right.
And so you have this period in which that happens.
Right.
And I think that when that happens, you are really sensitive.
Right.
And I think that it's a little bit analogous to what some men are going through, because I think many men are thinking, am I that bad guy? Have I done this bad thing? Why am I automatically assumed to be a
Right.
perpetrator, right? But it has to go way past that, because in fact, as you said, the desire culturally is to shove it in the women's issue box and make women deal with it. And every women's issue I've ever known is a problem with men.
Of course.
Right? It's a problem with how we interact. It's a problem with how we define roles. It's a problem with masculinity and femininity and this kind of almost fetishistic fixation on binaries, right? And so it really strikes me, I've thought a lot about it, and actually there's a chapter on silencing and a chapter on denial because of this. Why is it that the men in our lives who love us would be inclined to trivialize or doubt or minimize what we're saying, right? My brother and I grew up really close. We're 2 years apart. We are super close friends. And he will say it's almost like we had completely different childhood experiences walking side by side together. And he's right, But at one point, he was saying to me, his 16-year-old daughter, he was saying, "Oh my God, she's so lazy." She wanted me to drop her at the front door of her friend's house. I really was in a rush. I needed to drop her at the corner. And I said, "Are you kidding me? It's dark. It's 2 blocks. She's 16. She's already been massively harassed on the street. She's not going to walk alone." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And he just didn't see it. And when I went further and I said, she's been forced to think about rape for a very long time in a way you just are not acknowledging, because every interaction that we have like that, click, click, click. And he said, "That's impossible. Women don't think about rape that often." And so I thought, okay, well, this man loves me. He's one of my best friends. What is that? Why would he do that? And after thinking about it for many years, actually, it seems to make a lot of sense to me that if you are a man and you've learned since boyhood that the major components of your identity as a man are to protect and to provide. Almost every boy, whether he cares for it or not, learns that lesson.
Right.
Through the culture. You can bend over backwards and speak 7 different languages to your child and tell him, no, 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 and that will be irrelevant, right? But if a woman says to you, a woman that you care for, or a woman that you know, a friend or a coworker or a spouse, "I'm not feeling safe. This is happening to me. It's happening at work. It's happening on the bus. It's happening in, school." then the way that gets tessellated is I'm failing to protect. And and failure feels terrible, and then it feels pyrrhic, because no man can protect the women in his life. And as a matter of fact, pretending that he can and institutionalizing that protection and paternalism means we ignore the real threat, which comes from intimates. Most women are abused and battered and raped by men they know, not by strangers in an alley. And so it seems that the response that you're describing, which is defensiveness or fear, comes from an identity protective cognition. You know, I'm not that bad person. There are the bad people, and they know who they are. But most men are not doing these things in general, not all men, blah, blah, blah. But it seems to be a psychological defense mechanism that makes a lot of sense. And then there's just the sheer fact of acknowledging the privilege.
Right.
Acknowledging the privilege that indeed you have a sense of physical security and inviolability as a man, not as a boy, because boys and men are equally likely to be abused. Boys and girls are equally likely to be abused. But boys age out of that, and women never do. I mean, there's a 76-year-old woman who was raped in Central Park just a little while ago. You know, there's no point at which you can just think, I'm done with that threat. You know, and so I think we need to be interrogating masculinity really early, but also, you know, if men are worried right now in the workplace, then they should be addressing the institutional failures, because the same institutional failures that made it very difficult for women to work are now failing to protect them and create working environments that are fair. And so instead of blaming women who have been harassed for raising awareness, they would be better served and more genuinely protective if they actually change their cultures.
Yeah, I also feel like they just sometimes, like you said with your brother, you could be working next to them in the same office and they just don't see it.
But they don't have to.
Of course.
Right.
So the idea of, I have a modicum of empathy when you're suddenly gobsmacked with information that you literally didn't know you didn't know.
Right.
But then it does have to, I think that the double whammy is like, and this goes to the heart of your book, is, you know, once cat is out of the bag, the emotions are unleashed. And it is that thing of like when you have that awakening, you know, when you get woke, it's suddenly like everyone's got to deal with it, and it's very uncomfortable for them.
Well, that's the other thing. Like, in order to not let the anger consume you, you have to be comfortable with discomfort.
Right.
People are going to be uncomfortable, and we're not supposed to make people uncomfortable. Like, the primary lesson that you learn as a girl is to make people comfortable. You know, smile, use your nice voice. I mean, girls are told to use their nice voices 3 times more than boys by the time they're 7. And so instead of telling a girl to use her nice voice, ask her why she isn't, like, happy. Why are you speaking that way, you know? But telling her to use her nice voice is just telling her to shut up.
Right, of course.
You know, and so, yeah, you have to be uncomfortable making people uncomfortable, which isn't easy. I'm not really suggesting it's easy. It's really not.
No, it's very difficult. So talk about the end of your book and where you see, what you hope this book will accomplish in terms of writing about this, and given the moment that we're in culturally, you know, in the creative arts, in the political world. I mean, it clearly it has reached a tipping point. So much has been talked about. The impact it's going to have on the midterms. It's probably the single biggest issue is, you know, how women are going to show up and how they're going to vote. And they're going to vote emotionally because we're pissed at what's going on.
Right. But you know, it's interesting because, and I do talk about this, I don't think that anger is irrational, right? So we're dismissed often for emotionality. First of all, we're given, like literally given emotionality as a function of femininity. You're going to be the emotional sex, right? And then we're castigated for being emotional. So that's a no-win situation that we should all reject right away, right? And so one of the things that I would like to do with the book is provide a structure of thinking about the problem and a language to use around the problems that we encounter with these feelings, and sort of strategies for dismantling binaries, challenging stereotypes, addressing all forms of discrimination, because we're more or less talking about gender when really the problems are so much more intersectional, right? I mean, this affects people very differently depending on their race and ethnicity, whether they have disabilities or not. I mean, every one of those cross currents will make a difference. And deeply, really what we're talking about is status, right? Who has status in a society? Because anger is an entitlement of status in our society. So if you're a white guy, your anger has been always associated with righteous indignation and political power, right? But if you're a woman, it hasn't been.
Right.
It's associated with irrationality and madness and an inability to think straight. And so when we talk about women being angry and voting, so the rage vote, right? What we're really, really talking about is redefining citizenship. Whose anger and whose political efficacy matter? And how do we think of citizens? Do we think of citizens as people, all people who have dignity? Because the thing about femininity, particularly in the context of our ability to defend ourselves against indignity, is that there's a certain assumption that immanent in femininity is that we have to live with being with indignity. We have to live with the denigration of our culture, and that we should do that quietly, and that we should do it with a smile.
Yeah. It's hard to smile in the face of that when you've been holding it in for that long.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to smile when it starts,
Right.
And you do, because people are treating you like you're crazy for not smiling, And so I think that couching the problems through the filter of anger is just a way of looking at inequalities, And this entire book the same book could be written from the perspective of what happens to men and boys, right? And what I find most interesting, and there's so little research about this, is that when you step out of the social binaries that we are immersed in, and we look at the experiences of queer people and trans people, they tend, according to the scant research that exists, to actually have better regulation of their emotions, more mature regulation of their emotions, because in fact, they aren't really automatically adhering to gender stereotypes, and they're forced by the culture to make themselves in a way that if you just default, you just never have to deal with a lot of the time.
Wow. Well, I think we should open it up to questions.
Sure.
What do you think? I hope you guys.
It's really hard to see you all.
I know. It's like
Great.
so hard.
I know.
So I will bring a microphone if anyone has a question. Just a quick reminder around here, questions, I like to say, typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question, and tonight only Amy Baer gets to ask follow-up questions. Who would like to go first?
Any questions?
Any questions? Oh,
Yes?
over here. Right here.
You mentioned about your brother. What kind of background would you say that you had with your parents or with your caretakers, with your brother?
Interesting.
So I would say my family background was sort of a quite traditional nuclear family, Catholic and Episcopalian, Catholic and Anglican. What else do you mean?
Loving.
Oh, yes, very
encouraging
supportive, very loving.
The two of you to get along and
Oh,
to
yeah.
communicate, express yourself, so forth and so on.
Did we express ourselves? I would say yes, which meant that there was a lot of yelling. No, I mean, I think that we had as a brother and sister growing up, 2 years apart, we were constant companions. I mean, we did everything together. But when I walked down the street, I was hypervigilant to predatory men. And when he and our other male friend walked down the street, they were looking at the dogs. I mean, same street, same walk. We just had this conversation maybe 3 months ago. It was pretty funny. One of them said, "God, do you remember those dogs?" And I was like, "God, do you remember those men?" And they're like, "What men?" And I'm like, "The men with the dogs."
And did your parents, when you were growing up, were you empowered and enabled to believe you could do whatever you wanted when you grew up? Like, was there that feeling of, yeah, whatever you want to do or be or wherever you want to go, Soraya, go for it?
That's super interesting. I would say yes, and then this happened, which was formative, I think. So we went to Catholic schools, and I wanted to be a priest, high will to power. And so I said one day in the car, and I was the kid who actually read the Bible. I wanted to read the Bible. I'm like, I'm going to read the Bible, right? And then I'm going to read the catechism, and then I'm going to ask the priest some questions, and I'm going to ask him how to be a priest. And when I said that, my dad, who loves me and is very proud of me, he burst out laughing. Because for him, the idea that a girl could be a priest was so absurd. And so I looked at my mom, who was very, very traditional, but quite subversive in her own way, and she said, well, I really think you should talk to the priest about that. And the priest was drunk all the time. And he didn't have very good answers. And so our conversation, more or less, no kidding, went like this. Are you really telling me I can't be a priest because I don't have a penis? Yes. Which is just no answer to give someone.
Right.
And so I spent 10 years through Georgetown trying to figure out, could it really just be sexism?
Right.
Like, is that really what we're talking about
Right.
here?
Is it that basic?
Is it that basic? So then you read the theology, and you read the philosophy, and you talk to some Jesuits who aren't really Catholic. and you come to the conclusion that, yes, indeed,
Right.
it is sexism. No matter what you read, no matter what you think. And so yes, you can be everything you want to be, but no, you can't. And that's just incoherent, and any kid recognizes incoherence. And so I stopped going to church when I was 12, more or less. I was like, no, you can go, and I'm going to stay home. And my parents were like, okay. So I would go for like high holy holidays. But it was pretty clear to me. I was like, and this was something my parents gave me. I was like, that institution does not respect me,
Right.
and I don't respect the institution, which kind of made it difficult for my parents. But they were like, okay.
Yeah, so it was like you can do whatever you want to, but that institution, you couldn't do that because the institution we adhere to doesn't recognize the possibility.
Right. And so my question has always since been, why would you belong to that institution?
Of course.
It makes
understand
zero
that.
sense to me, right? And indeed, the fundamental corruption that we know the institution is plagued by, I mean, to me, it's kind of a global criminal enterprise, right? I mean, it's protecting child rapists, and it continues to protect child rapists. And if you'd been a person who said that for decades, you were considered crazy. Crazy. And that's how gaslighting works. And so that model, to me, is a good way of explaining women's status in the world, right? I mean, it's a fraternity. It's a giant fraternity with immense wealth and power, and men with status can count on their credibility and entitlement to silence more vulnerable people. And in that context, those people were boys and girls. I mean, we talk about the rape of boys, but indeed, probably half of the kids abused were girls, and we never talk about that. Because of course men rape girls.
Right.
Like, yeah,
The real perversion is men
raping the boys. And actually, if you think about it, in the last 10 years, the catalytic rape stories have all been about the rapes of boys and men. Rape in the military, rape in the Boy Scouts, rape, even there was a big BBC scandal where a very prominent journalist or, presenter was serially abusing children, many of them boys. And so to admit to what it means to have boys raped as a function of status and not their inherent tempting ways is a hard cultural confrontation. I don't think we're confronting it yet.
No. But in answer to your question, she had a happy childhood.
I did. I had a super happy childhood.
Okay, we'll take the next question back here. Thanks.
I like your polka dot dress. My name is Dimitri. Thank you for coming.
Thank
during
you.
the talk. Can you tell me, this book seems to be about anger, and the opposite of anger is patience, as you know.
I
The
would
opposite
disagree
of
with you,
pride
but
is humility. The opposite of greed is charity. The opposite of gluttony is moderation. The opposite of lust is abstinence. The opposite of envy is generosity of spirit. And the opposite of sloth is diligence. If you were to choose one of these for your next book, which one would it be and why?
you might have to read that again. If I had to choose, are you asking me if I had to choose a vice?
Right. If you could choose one of these, like anger, we know you walk into a room and it's anger, right? And I'm just kidding, but if you could choose like pride over pride, greed, gluttony, lust, envy, sloth.
Oh, I would pick pride. I'd pick pride. Oh, because masculine pride is killing women. That's like a straight line correlation. No doubt in my mind at all.
Thank you. I love what you say that rage is the way for women. Can you just tell us a little bit more about rage and empathy? I was surprised you used
Sure.
that word empathy, and how we might impart those lessons in a very concrete way to all women, especially to younger women.
Good question.
So I would modify that a little bit to say that we really need to impart it to everyone, because what we learn in childhood, that's borne out by many decades of research, is that very early, by the time children are 3 or 4, they associate anger with men and power and destruction. And that's a profoundly unempathetic cultural truth. For boys to strip themselves of their full humanity, we basically shut them off from emotionality, and being emotional, being sad, being fearful, being even kind in some contexts is considered a feminine degradation. So we're growing boys into men who don't mature into men, but rather reject femininity. And that's really toxic to the culture and to boys, because in the end, if they are unable to express themselves fully, we end up with high rates of suicide and high rates of violence against others, you know? And so I think the quality of empathy is one that is considered much more feminine, which is a mistake. Boys and men are not born any less able to empathize. We kind of shame them out of empathizing, particularly cross-gender empathizing. And so the reason I say it's the way forward is because if you think of what Audre Lorde said many years ago, she said, anger's full of information. And when we shut down girls' anger, when we shut down women's anger, which we do, we punish women for it every day, all day, we deny the information. And that's very valuable information. Right now, it's very valuable information to save the democracy, right? Like, we need that information, but instead what we have is a persistent epistemological void. We don't want the information, we don't want to share the information, we don't want to believe the information, and so we keep perpetuating rape myths. I mean, every time somebody comments on Kavanaugh on the right, they perpetuate a rape myth.
I mean, correlating empathy with anger, does that deny women in particular just a right to be balls out angry?
Not at all. I mean, I think that women who are visibly displaying aggression, because I think maybe what you're talking about is aggression, right? You can be deeply angry without being assertive or aggressive. You can be really aggressive without any anger at all. You're just out to mess with someone, right? So I think that you can have what you're describing, which I would say is more like a rage. You just need to rage about something. And that can come from deep compassion and deep empathy, right? I mean, I don't understand why people aren't angry about social injustice. But many people don't care. They simply don't care. They're just going to go about their business, and whatever happens, happens, because we live in a meritocracy, and if you're poor, it's because you're stupid and lazy, and if you're raped, it's because you dressed badly and went to the wrong place, and it's just not any of their business, right? I find that all enraging. That's enraging to me. But and I would say that for me personally, that comes from a sense of empathy. It doesn't stop me from visibly being angry, though. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm still a little unclear.
About the empathy?
No, I appreciate the empathy, just giving women
Well, for sure.
which is, as you so well put,
Right. Well, I mean, I think that I write in the book that every time I see that, I'm grateful to that woman. Because we just don't have enough examples of women acting in those ways and not being punished. I think the quality here is punishment, right? So when men act in those ways, they actually gain power.
Right.
But when women act in those ways, they are powerless. They actually are penalized for it. And they're penalized for it at work by getting no promotions
Right.
or not getting salary increases or being fired, right? Or being disliked because they're the bitchy person in the office. And, girls in college, for example, who are trying to fight for racial justice or for gay rights or for gender equality, they are disliked because they are assertive and articulate and they're angry about the things that are important to them. So I think more women are comfortable displaying that, and I actually think that's a function a lot of Title IX. So we have a full generation of girls who've gone through sports, team sports, the regulation of aggression, conflict, all of these things that before boys were socialized to be better at. And not only have they done it, but they also have role models that also did it. And so what we're seeing now in activism, I don't think we can separate from the impact of Title IX on the culture.
Hi. So there are women who voted for Trump.
Yes. There are white women who voted
There
for
are
Trump.
white women, and worse, there are white women who are continuing to defend that decision.
Right.
Can you punish them? Can you explain them?
So honestly, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me for a variety of reasons. One, we live in this deeply racist culture, and white women's femininity has always been a lever of violence against black people and brown people. And so if you think about what Trump said at his rallies, right, rallies that were filled with contempt and disgust and rage, he repeatedly pointed towards the vulnerability of white women to predation from immigrant men. The brown men are going to rape you, the Mexicans are going to rape you. The Central Park Five raped people. The Central Park Five did not rape anybody, right? China is going to rape us. And so his whole...
You left out the whole Middle East.
The whole Middle East. The terrorists are definitely coming to rape you, right? And so he tapped into this really atavistic sense that the acme of American innocence and beauty is a vulnerable white woman. And so I don't know how many people are familiar with white women tears, the whole explanation of what that is. But the tears of white women for centuries have been weaponized in ways that are deeply destructive to other people's lives and to the fabric of the society. And so it makes sense to me that those women would vote for a higher racial status in a situation in which they actually probably are experiencing greater gender inequality. So when you are weighing status in those ways, it's not even conscious, right? But if you can leverage your whiteness, then you will, because you certainly can't leverage your gender if you're on the right. You are definitely a second-class citizen, and we see that in all kinds of ways, particularly if you think of authoritarianism and the authoritarian tendencies that we see in our culture. The number two main constituents that display authoritarian beliefs are Roman Catholics and evangelicals, and those are really rigid, gender-stratified societies. And across the globe, the communities that have the greatest early adoption of authoritarianism are those with the biggest gender gaps, because women who face real inequality look for a strong protector in the culture that's going to enforce rules that they feel more comfortable with. And so it's not a mystery to me, really, why people voted the way they did.
Do you think there was also an angry backlash from women against Hillary?
Well, this is interesting about that. I think
Because I talked to tons of women.
they hate Hillary.
Tons of women
who hate
hated
Hillary.
her.
And this is interesting too, because Harvard did a study of 20,000 high school students a few years ago, and they asked them what they thought about leaders and leadership in their own schools. And the people that high school students of all classes, races, ethnicities, genders feel are the best leaders in their schools are young white men. And then, interestingly enough, black women, black girls, so white boys and black girls. And then the least trustworthy in their mind, the least capable, are white girls, which makes sense too if you think about the way our culture represents white girls, as in need of protection, half babies a lot of the time, sex objects, more likely, right? And so what was most glaring in the research to me was that that hierarchy existed, but the people least likely to support a white girl were other white girls. And there's a whole psychology behind why that would be. But that whole high school dynamic was out in spades during the election. You know? Because if a woman like Hillary Clinton, whether you like her or not, is perceived as transgressing, which she was, because this country voted her the most admired woman for 10 years straight. As long as she's down, as long as she's somehow not seeking power, not asserting a will, anything but actually actively seeking authority, people loved her. But the minute she switched over into a really gender transgressive role, she was reviled, and particularly by white women. Something like 98% of black women in the country voted for Hillary Clinton.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you.
How are you?
So good. I can't wait to read your book. Not a question, but a statement. My question is about the tendency to expect women to be apologetic and grateful.
All the
That we're
time.
constantly having to express being sorry for our presence or our whatever, just existence, words, etc. But simultaneously, maybe sort of this privilege checking and especially with white women, but and perpetuated on social media. And how do we get rid of that? I mean, that's sort of the other, maybe the flip side of rage. Like in order to be allowed to have rage, sometimes we have to also have this kind of background of a good track record for having been sorry and grateful for everything.
I mean, I think a lot of that, like I was a child, at one point my mother said, "You're 20 feet away from me, I dropped the bowl, why did you apologize?" Right? Because she dropped the bowl and I was like, sorry. Right? And that happens to a lot of us. We just, whatever it is in the culture, and there's a lot, right? There's media, there's religion, there's all kinds of things, right? You end up actually ultimately apologizing just for being. And that happens to a lot of women. And I mean, I think that's sort of undeniable. And some of it comes from the mandate that we put others first all the time, being very other-focused all the time. And so putting aside your anger, swallowing your anger, is just part of that. And I don't think you can separate the apology from the anger. I will say, this is maybe not related, but I think it is kind of funny. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they said, there are all these tweets. Women are really tweeting about their anger. And I said, yeah, they're amazing. A woman tweets about her rage, and 20,000 people have retweeted it in a minute. But what I find interesting about the tweets is how the language that's being used in the tweets. It's, I want to smash things, I want to hit things, I want to break things, I want to throw things. And there are all these very sort of physical, destructive, very masculine anger ideas. But so much of the language of anger is not that. And actually, so much of the language of anger comes from kitchens. So anger simmers, it boils over, you're supposed to put a lid on it, you're supposed to, and there are many of these. And I always laugh because I'm like, okay, so those are women in kitchens. That language didn't come out of nowhere, And so it's interesting to me that in the political context, the language switches into masculine expressions, even though women are expressing it. Not with apology. They're not doing it with apology.
And our final question for the evening.
Hi.
Hi.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
It's really amazing to see you here. So I feel like leading up to the nomination, which seems even inevitable with what's going on, that we're kind of like at a Malcolm X moment for women, that we need sort of a feminist Malcolm
Dietland.
X. Well, an armed struggle.
Right.
And how do you feel about women exercising violence in that way? The Peshmerga in Kurdistan is one good example. It's a very
Sorry, what was the good example?
Peshmerga, all
Yes.
women fighters with a political agenda. About an armed struggle that maybe women could start in this country.
So I have to admit that I would rather that women run for office and support other women running for office and take over institutions. Like, I agree with you that, I mean, I'm trying to think of an example that exists right now of armed revolutionary uprising. Can you think of one in the country? No, I can't think of one either, right? There are examples of other countries, and I am curious why that is, actually. I'm very surprised by that. But I feel pretty strongly that the best thing we can do is vote assholes out of office and take over institutions and far exceed parity, actually. Like, we keep striving for parity. We're not even close to parity. And I don't know, maybe parity is a really low bar, you know? I mean, there are more than enough competent women that can run for office and win. But it's slower than I think you're hoping. And I think that, like, for you and I, media activism is really important, and telling stories and shaping narratives. And I kind of hesitate to think in terms of weaponization, because actually I kind of want to reject the militaristic aspect of it, but I certainly understand your frustration. I'm maybe not as radical as you are. A camera is a gun, and words are guns, you know? And so I just think that that violence may be necessary in some contexts to move the center, right? Because you need to wake people up and make them understand how bad it is, because it's really bad. And sometimes violence does that. But I would much rather have newsrooms that understand why 30 years of clinic violence is domestic terrorism and should be labeled a hate crime. You know, I'd rather have a civil rights department that prosecutes hate crimes as a symbolic reflection of what the culture values. You know, I mean, stranger rapes they're the paradigm of a hate crime, but one of the rationales for not counting them is because there are just too many, right? I mean, what is that? So, yeah, I mean, I would rather continue plugging away with the politics and the media, but I certainly understand that response. I didn't really answer your question.
Thank you, Amy,
Thank
for
you so
taking
Thank you
the
so
time.
much. Thank you for
Thank
coming
you
tonight.
guys. Thank you for being